respected. Sometimes the man who looks like he doesn't care is actually thinking about you more than you realize. But here's the part nobody tells you. You won't always see it in his texts, his calls, or some dramatic confession. Sometimes you see it in the little things he does without even realizing he's revealing himself. And if you've been sitting there wondering, does he even like me or am I imagining everything? I want you to listen carefully, because there is a difference between a man who is simply being polite and a man whose attention keeps returning to you. You may not notice it at first. He might not text you every morning. He might not call you every night. He might not openly flirt with you. In fact, sometimes he may appear completely normal around you. But then something happens. You mention something casually 1 week, and weeks later he remembers it. You tell him about a project you're working on, and later he asks how it went. You mention that you don't like a certain restaurant, and months later he remembers you tell him you're nervous about something, and somehow he checks on you afterward. Those moments can seem small. But sometimes, small things reveal where someone's attention naturally goes. Think about your own life. You don't remember every detail that every person tells you. You can't. There are too many conversations, too many responsibilities, too many people crossing your path. But certain people stay in your mind. Their words stay with you. Something they said comes back to you when you see something connected to it. You hear a song and remember them. You pass a restaurant and remember a conversation. You see something funny and immediately think, she would laugh at this. That's what happens when someone's presence has started occupying mental space. And sometimes a man doesn't even realize how often he's thinking about you. He may tell himself that he's not interested. He may convince himself that he's simply being friendly. He may even try to keep emotional distance. But attention has a way of revealing what the mind keeps returning to. There was a woman named Sarah who experienced exactly this. She had been talking to Daniel for several months. Nothing about their relationship was obvious. There were no dramatic declarations. There wasn't constant flirting. Some days they barely spoke. And because of that, Sarah assumed Daniel wasn't interested. She told her friend, if he actually liked me, wouldn't he make it obvious? Her friend asked her a simple question. What makes you think he doesn't? Sarah didn't know how to answer. She simply pointed to the obvious things. He doesn't text me all the time. He doesn't tell me how he feels. Sometimes he takes hours to respond. He acts completely normal around me. Her friend smiled and said, okay, but what does he do when you're actually around him? Sarah started thinking, and suddenly she remembered things she had overlooked. Daniel remembered her coffee order. He remembered the name of a book she had mentioned once. When she had been preparing for an important presentation, he asked her about it several days later. When she changed her hairstyle, he noticed. When she was quieter than usual, he asked if everything was okay. And one day, Sarah casually mentioned that she had always wanted to visit a particular city. She forgot about the conversation. Daniel didn't. A few weeks later, they were talking about travel, and he said, didn't you say you wanted to go there someday? Sarah looked at him. She had almost forgotten saying it. He hadn't. And that was when she started realizing something. Maybe his feelings weren't as invisible as she thought. Maybe she had been looking for the wrong evidence. She had been waiting for a dramatic text. She had been waiting for a confession. She had been waiting for him to suddenly become obvious. But real interest isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's attention. Sometimes it's memory. Sometimes it's curiosity. Sometimes it's the fact that your words don't disappear from his mind after the conversation ends. Now, let me be clear about something. Remembering one detail does not mean a man is secretly in love with you. Being friendly does not mean someone wants a relationship. And noticing your haircut isn't proof of anything. You have to look at the pattern. That's where things become interesting. Because when a man repeatedly remembers things about you, repeatedly finds reasons to interact with you, repeatedly notices changes in your mood, and consistently shows curiosity about your life, you're no longer looking at one isolated behavior. You're looking at a pattern of attention. And attention is valuable. People give attention to what matters to them. The question is not whether he notices you once. The question is how often his attention naturally returns to you. Sarah began noticing another pattern. Whenever they were in a group, Daniel somehow ended up talking to her. Not always, not obviously, but often enough that she couldn't ignore it. If she made a joke, he looked at her reaction. If she shared an opinion, he listened. If she left the room, he sometimes asked where she had gone. And when she returned, he seemed to notice. Again, none of this was absolute proof. But together, these small behaviors create a different picture. And that's the thing about genuine interest. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it leaks out through attention. A man can control what he says. He can choose not to send a message. He can tell himself to stay calm. He can even convince himself that he isn't emotionally invested. But what he repeatedly notices can be much harder to control because your mind naturally pays attention to what it considers important. And when someone keeps finding their way into your thoughts, their details begin sticking. Their preferences, their stories, their expressions, their habits, their little reactions. You start remembering things without trying. And sometimes that's the first clue that someone has become mentally significant to you. But Sarah was about to discover another sign, because remembering her words was one thing. What happened when she became distant was something else entirely. And that was when she began to realize that sometimes you can learn more about someone's feelings by watching what they notice when you're not giving them your usual attention. Because when your presence suddenly becomes less available, the person who has been quietly paying attention may reveal just how much space you were occupying in their mind. And Sarah was about to find out exactly what that looked like. Sarah didn't plan to become distant from Daniel. It simply happened. Life became busy. She had work to finish, family responsibilities, and a few personal things occupying her mind. For the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about whether Daniel had texted her. And then something interesting happened. Daniel noticed, not dramatically. He didn't suddenly send 20 messages. He didn't ask where she had been. Instead, the next time they spoke, he said, "You seem quiet lately. Everything okay?" And Sarah almost laughed because she hadn't told him she was pulling back. She hadn't announced it. She hadn't posted anything. She had simply stopped giving him the same amount of attention. And he noticed the difference. That doesn't automatically mean he was in love with her, but it did tell her something important. Her presence had become familiar enough to him that her absence felt different. That's a subtle distinction. When someone becomes part of your mental routine, you notice when something changes. Think about it. If someone you barely know stops talking to you, you may not even notice. But if someone you regularly speak with suddenly becomes quieter, you feel it. You wonder what's wrong. You notice the missing conversation. You may even find yourself checking your phone. That's why one of the most interesting signs that someone is thinking about you is not always how much they contact you. Sometimes it's how quickly they notice a change in your behavior. Daniel started asking more questions, not invasive questions, just small ones. How's work going? Did you ever finish that project? Lord, are you still planning that trip? Did your friend get better? Sarah realized that he remembered things from previous conversations. He wasn't simply asking random questions to keep the conversation alive. He was following the story of her life. And that distinction matters. When someone genuinely pays attention, they don't just hear your words. They remember the context behind them. They know what you're working toward. They remember what you're worried about. They notice when something has changed. And sometimes they bring those things back into conversation without even realizing how revealing it is. But Sarah also noticed something else. Daniel began finding small reasons to interact with her. He might send her a funny video connected to something she had once mentioned. He might ask her opinion about something he could easily have decided himself. He might send a message about a place they had talked about weeks earlier. None of these things were romantic declarations, but they created little bridges back to her. And that is something people often do when someone is on their mind. They find reasons to reconnect, not necessarily because they have consciously decided, I want a relationship with this person. Sometimes it's much simpler. Something reminds them of you. They think of you and they reach out. That is why you shouldn't obsess over the exact wording of a message. Look at the pattern behind it. If a man repeatedly finds natural reasons to talk to you, remembers your interests, asks about your life, and continues creating opportunities for interaction, that's more meaningful than one random compliment. But there is another side to this. Sometimes a man can think about you constantly and still do very little about it. Why? Because thinking about someone and being ready for a relationship are two different things. A man can be interested and still be shy. He can be attracted and still be uncertain. He can care and still be afraid of rejection. He can think about you and still struggle to communicate. And that's why you should never turn subtle signs into absolute certainty. You are looking for evidence of interest. You are not creating a fantasy. Sarah had to learn this distinction. She was excited by what she was noticing, but she didn't want to make the mistake of turning every small behavior into proof that Daniel secretly loved her. So she watched, and what she saw became more interesting. Daniel seemed particularly attentive when Sarah talked about her goals. She had once mentioned that she wanted to change careers. Most people had forgotten. Daniel hadn't. One afternoon he asked, "Did you ever look into that course you were talking about?" Sarah stared at him. It had been almost 2 months. She hadn't even remembered telling him about it. And suddenly she realized something. He wasn't only remembering facts about her. He was remembering things that mattered to her, that can be meaningful. Because when someone cares about your life, they become curious about the things that matter to you. They don't only want your attention, they want to understand you. And that is a much deeper form of interest. But then came another moment. Sarah was talking to a group of friends when she mentioned that she had been having a difficult week. Daniel was across the room. He wasn't part of the conversation. But later when they were alone, he asked her, "Are you okay? You seemed stressed earlier." Sarah hadn't realized he was paying attention. She smiled and said, "I'm fine." But Daniel didn't immediately accept the answer. He simply said, "You don't really look fine." That sentence stayed with her because there are people who hear your words, and then there are people who notice the difference between your words and your emotions. Again, it wasn't proof of love, but it was evidence that he was paying attention. And attention repeated over time can reveal emotional significance. Then something happened that Sarah hadn't expected. She stopped initiating conversations altogether, not as a test, not to manipulate him, not to make him chase her. She simply wanted to see what happened when she stopped carrying the connection. And within a few days, Daniel reached out. Nothing dramatic, just a simple message. "Hey, haven't heard from you in a while. Everything good?" Sarah looked at the screen for several seconds because the message wasn't romantic, but it answered a question she had been asking herself. He had noticed. He had felt the change. He had thought about her absence enough to reach out. And that was the moment Sarah understood something important. Sometimes a clearer sign that someone has you on their mind isn't how intensely they pursue you, it's whether they notice when you're no longer around. Because when someone becomes part of your emotional routine, their absence creates a small silence. And people notice silence when they were used to hearing you. But Sarah still had to be careful because there's a difference between missing someone's attention and genuinely wanting a relationship with them. A man can miss talking to you. He can enjoy your company. He can think you're attractive. He can even feel emotionally attached and still not be ready to build something serious. That's why the strongest evidence would not come from how Daniel reacted when Sarah became distant. It would come from what he consistently did when she was present. Did he make effort? Did he respect her? Did he listen? Did he remember? Did he show genuine curiosity about her life? Did his actions match his words? Those were the questions Sarah needed to answer. And the next behavior she noticed was perhaps the most revealing of all, because Daniel didn't just remember what Sarah said. He started remembering how she felt. And that was something Sarah couldn't ignore. Sarah had spent so much time wondering whether Daniel noticed her that she hadn't realized something even more important. He wasn't just remembering what she said. He was remembering how she felt. And that distinction changed everything. One afternoon, Sarah mentioned that she had an important meeting coming up. She didn't make a big deal about it. In fact, she almost forgot she had told Daniel. A few days later, her phone buzzed. "Hope your meeting went well today. T." Sarah stared at the message. It was such a simple sentence, but it told her something he had remembered. Not because she had reminded him, not because she had asked him to check on her. He had simply kept it in his mind. That's what happens when someone becomes mentally significant. Their details don't always require effort to remember. They stay there naturally. And Sarah began noticing this pattern everywhere. If she mentioned being nervous about something, Daniel remembered. If she talked about an upcoming event, he asked how it went. If she told him she was excited about something, he wanted to know what happened afterward. He wasn't interrogating her. He wasn't trying to impress her. He was simply paying attention. And sometimes genuine interest looks exactly like that. It isn't always dramatic. It's consistency. It's remembering the little things because the person matters enough for those little things to matter to you. But there was another behavior Sarah noticed. Daniel started seeking her opinion. It wasn't constant. It wasn't obvious. But every now and then he would ask, "What do you think?" About a restaurant, about a movie, about a decision he was making, about something he was considering buying. At first, Sarah thought nothing of it. Then she realized that he didn't ask everyone. Sometimes he specifically wanted her perspective. That can be meaningful because when someone values your presence in their mind, they may begin valuing your perspective too. They don't just want to talk to you, they want to know what you think. And when your opinion starts influencing small parts of someone's life, it can be a sign that you have become emotionally significant to them. But again, Sarah reminded herself not to jump to conclusions. A man asking for your opinion doesn't automatically mean he wants a relationship. Friendship can look like this, respect can look like this. Interest can look like this. The difference comes from the larger pattern, and the larger pattern with Daniel was becoming difficult to ignore. He remembered, he noticed, he checked in, he found reasons to talk. He paid attention to changes in her mood, and he seemed genuinely curious about what was happening in her life. Then one evening, Sarah experienced something that made everything suddenly clearer. She was telling Daniel about a difficult situation with someone close to her. She expected him to give advice. Instead, he asked her a question. "What do you actually want to happen?" Sarah paused. She realized that most people had been telling her what she should do. Daniel was asking what she wanted, and that showed her that he wasn't simply listening for a chance to speak. He was trying to understand her perspective. That kind of attention feels different because when someone is genuinely interested in you, they become curious about the person underneath the story. They want to know why something matters to you. They want to understand how you think. They want to know what makes you happy, what makes you uncomfortable, what you value, or what you are working toward. And slowly, Sarah realized that Daniel seemed to be collecting little pieces of her personality, not in a strange way, naturally. He knew she preferred quiet places. He knew she didn't like being rushed. He knew which kind of humor made her laugh. He knew which subjects made her passionate. He knew when she needed space, and he knew when she wanted someone to simply listen. That is much deeper than remembering someone's favorite color. It is remembering the person, and sometimes that is what it looks like when someone is thinking about you more than they admit. Their mind begins building a picture of you, your habits, your preferences, your reactions, your personality. And because they care about that picture, they remember it. But then Sarah noticed something else. Daniel started bringing her into conversations even when she wasn't there. They had mutual friends. One evening, one of them casually mentioned a restaurant. Daniel immediately said, "Sarah would probably love that place." Sarah wasn't even there. She found out about it later, and that made her smile because it meant she had crossed his mind even when there was no reason for her to be part of the conversation. That doesn't mean he was obsessed. It doesn't mean he was secretly planning their future. It simply meant she had become someone his mind naturally connected to certain things. And that is a very human sign of emotional significance. When someone matters to you, your brain starts making associations. You see something they would like. You hear something they once mentioned. You visit a place they talked about, and suddenly they're in your thoughts. You don't have to force it. It just happens. Sarah finally understood why she had been so confused. She had been expecting Daniel's interest to look like constant texting, but Daniel wasn't necessarily a constant texter. His interest appeared in another language: attention, memory, curiosity, consistency. And that taught Sarah an important lesson. Never measure someone's feelings only by how frequently they use their phone. Some people are terrible texters and still deeply care. Some people text constantly and still have no serious intentions. Communication style matters, but behavior matters more. Then Sarah noticed one final pattern. Whenever she shared something personal, Daniel treated it carefully. He didn't turn her vulnerability into gossip. He didn't make jokes about things she had told him privately. He didn't use her insecurities against her during disagreements. He respected what she trusted him with. And that was perhaps the strongest sign of all, because attention can come from curiosity, but respect comes from value. When someone protects the things you trust them with, they're showing you that your emotional world matters. Sarah wasn't completely certain what Daniel wanted, and honestly, she didn't need to be. She wasn't going to create a fantasy around him. She wasn't going to convince herself that every small gesture meant love. Instead, she decided to watch what happened over time, because time has a way of separating genuine interest from temporary attention. If he continued showing up, she would notice. If he became inconsistent, she would notice. If his actions matched his words, she would notice. And if he eventually told her how he felt, she would listen. But she wouldn't chase an answer. She had finally learned that you don't have to force someone to reveal what's already being shown through their behavior. And there was one last question Sarah needed to answer. Was Daniel simply thinking about her because he enjoyed her company? Or was his attention beginning to point towards something deeper? The answer wouldn't come from one text. It wouldn't come from one look. It wouldn't come from one conversation. It would come from what he consistently chose to do when he had every opportunity to walk away. And that was where Sarah finally understood the real meaning of being on someone's mind. Because when someone truly values you, their thoughts eventually become actions. And that is where everything becomes clear. Sarah had finally reached the point where she stopped trying to read Daniel's mind. She started reading his behavior instead. And that changed everything. Because there is a huge difference between wondering whether someone thinks about you and watching how often their thoughts naturally turn into actions. Daniel didn't suddenly become a different person. He didn't start sending endless messages. He didn't make some dramatic confession. Instead, his behavior became more consistent. He remembered the things Sarah cared about. He followed up on conversations. He noticed when something was wrong. He asked questions because he genuinely wanted to understand her. And when Sarah needed space, he respected it. When she needed support, he showed up. That was when Sarah realized something important: being on someone's mind isn't necessarily about how often they contact you. It's about whether you have become important enough that they naturally consider you in their decisions, conversations, memories, and everyday life. That's the difference between attention and genuine interest. Attention can be temporary. Interest creates a pattern. And love, when it is healthy and genuine, eventually becomes visible through consistency. Sarah also learned not to confuse mixed signals with hidden love. If a man repeatedly disappears, ignores your boundaries, refuses to communicate, and only appears when it is convenient for him, you shouldn't create a romantic explanation for that behavior simply because you hope he cares. Sometimes silence is just silence. Sometimes inconsistency is simply inconsistency. And sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is stop trying to decode someone and let their actions speak for themselves. That realization gave Sarah freedom. She didn't need Daniel to secretly think about her every minute. She didn't need him to prove that she was special. She didn't need to monitor every message, every glance, or every social media activity. She simply needed to observe whether the relationship was healthy, mutual, and consistent. And eventually, Daniel did something simple. He told her the truth. He admitted that he had been interested in her for a long time. He explained that he had been cautious because he wasn't sure how she felt. He had noticed her pulling away. He had missed their conversations. He had remembered the small things she told him. And yes, she had been on his mind far more often than she realized. But the most important part wasn't the confession. It was everything that came after it. his actions continued matching his words. He communicated more clearly. He made intentional plans. He respected her boundaries. He didn't expect Sarah to immediately trust every word he said. He understood that trust had to be built. And that's what made the difference. Sarah realized that the real proof wasn't that Daniel had secretly been thinking about her. The real proof was that when the opportunity came to be honest, he chose honesty. When the opportunity came to make effort, he made effort. When the opportunity came to respect her, he respected her. That's what you should look for. Not obsession, not constant texting, not jealousy, not mind games, not some secret psychological trick. Look for consistency. Look for genuine curiosity. Look for respect. Look for effort. Look for someone whose actions make their intentions clearer over time. Because if someone is thinking about you nonstop but never treats you with respect, what good is knowing that? If someone misses you but refuses to communicate honestly, what good is that? If someone is attracted to you but doesn't value your boundaries, that's not the kind of attention you need. You deserve more than being on someone's mind. You deserve to be treated like someone who matters. And that's the message Sarah carried with her. She stopped asking, how can I make him think about me? And started asking, does the way he treats me show that I matter? That question protects your heart because you don't need to manipulate someone's attention. You don't need to disappear just to make him chase you. You don't need to create jealousy. You don't need to play games. If someone genuinely values you, you won't have to manufacture your importance. Their behavior will reveal it. Maybe he remembers something you said weeks ago. Maybe he notices when your energy changes. Maybe he finds natural reasons to talk to you. Maybe he asks about things that matter to you. Maybe he seeks your opinion. Maybe he brings you up in conversations when you're not even there. Those things can be meaningful. But don't stop there. Watch what happens next. Does attention become effort? Does curiosity become communication? Does attraction become respect? Does interest become consistency? Because that's where real relationships are built. And if you're currently sitting there wondering whether a man is thinking about you, take a breath. You don't need to investigate every little sign. You don't need to become obsessed with decoding him. Give the relationship room to reveal itself. Pay attention to patterns, protect your standards, and remember that someone thinking about you is nice. Someone choosing to treat you well is far more valuable. Because being on someone's mind can create curiosity, but being valued creates security. And if he truly wants a place in your life, eventually his thoughts will have to become actions. That's the part you should watch. Not the fantasy, not the possibility, not the story you could create in your head, the pattern. Because when someone genuinely values you, you won't have to spend forever wondering where you stand. Their consistency will begin answering the question for you. And that is how Sarah finally stopped asking whether Daniel liked her. She simply watched what he did, and in the end, his actions told her everything she needed to know. If you think he doesn't like you, don't rush to believe that silence means indifference. Sometimes interest is hidden in the details, the things he remembers, the questions he asks, the way he notices your mood, and the small reasons he finds to stay connected. But don't build a love story from one sign. Watch the pattern, because someone thinking about you is not enough. What matters is whether those thoughts eventually become effort, respect, communication, and consistency. You don't need to chase him to prove that you're valuable. You don't need to create jealousy. You don't need to disappear just to make someone notice you. Let his actions speak. If he genuinely values you, over time, his attention will become clearer through the way he treats you. And if his actions remain inconsistent, don't invent excuses for him. Your worth doesn't depend on whether one man thinks about you. The right person won't leave you permanently confused about your value. Remember this, being on someone's mind may create curiosity, but being valued, respected, and consistently chosen is what creates real love.